about food today. So as Miss Amanda mentioned, my name's Amanda as well, Amanda Turner. I am a dietitian. So what I do is I work with kids on how to eat healthy for their bodies now when you're staying really active. And as you can imagine, 100 or 200 years ago, our food probably looked very different, and how we cook our food and prepare our food was very different. So what I'm going to talk about today is what were some of those differences, and how has it impacted our lives today, and how has it changed our nutrition over time. So I don't know if you guys have seen the My Plate nutrition recommendations, but today we have what are called the USDA nutrition recommendations, and it's in the form of a plate. So we know through science that there are certain nutrition needs that we have as adults and as kids in order to keep our bodies healthy for long periods of time. But when the pioneers were traveling and foraging and hunting, they didn't have any type of nutrition direction to go off of. So what we're going to do today is explore what could their plate have looked like? What did their nutrition look like compared to what our plate looks like today? So you see on the 2020 My Plate, our goal is to get all 5 food groups in at each of our meals. We need grains and protein and fruits and vegetables and dairy. And you're gonna see how a lot of these foods were incorporated into the pioneers' plate, but maybe just a little bit differently than how we do it today. So pioneer food needs were a little bit different than what we need today. They needed food to be able to travel with them. So they were using a buggy in order to get their food to their next location. They didn't have refrigerators at the time, and it would look pretty silly to put a refrigerator on a buggy, right? So we didn't have that convenience. So their food had to be very shelf stable. So it needed to be able to stay good for long periods of time, whether it was in the heat or whether it was in the cold. So they would use things like extra salt on their food and a lot of extra sugar in order to keep things good for long periods of time. Their food was typically rationed, especially when they were traveling, so that they weren't wasting any food. So whatever portions they took is what they were expected to eat, or whatever they were given is what they were expected to eat, because if they were eating more, they would run out of food faster and potentially not have enough for their travels. Food needed to be affordable. And a lot of times it was, to make it affordable, they were looking for things that were close by. So they were getting food that was in their area. Today, we don't need to be in Florida to get oranges, and we don't need to be in California to get avocados. But if they weren't in those areas and they were just here in Colorado, they probably didn't have a lot of those fresh fruits and vegetables around them. So they wouldn't have had those as part of their diet. So getting food was very different. They would get food primarily by hunting and gathering. As you just heard, they would have rifles, they would be able to hunt deer. Maybe you guys are familiar with someone who does hunt deer. Or gathering, they would go around and look for vegetables and fruits and grains that were in the area and be able to turn those into foods that they could eat. So again, they were very limited to what was closest to them at that time. Versus now, we've got these big grocery stores, and we can have foods from all over the United States, all in one specific location. So it's pretty cool that we can just access one place and get anything from pineapples to oranges to avocados to beef to fish. Everything is in one specific spot. So since they didn't have that refrigeration back then, they weren't able to bring all of these extra foods with them and combine them all in one place. Preparing food was also very different. So you saw the cooking techniques that were just shown on the video. Back then we were using a campfire in order to cook. And as he said, the pots would get really hot. And so you had to be really careful around that fire. So it just took a lot longer to prepare that food. Or I put pictures of berries here because they would, again, be out looking for things, gathering them, and maybe eating them more raw than we would today. Even things like potatoes, excuse me, would be eaten raw, whereas today we know we want to cook them because it's a safer way to eat those potatoes. So now we've got these modern conveniences of a stove and a refrigerator and a microwave, which cooks food very, very quickly. So the amount of time that we take to prepare food is very different and a lot faster than it was back then. And then a really big one that I think we don't think about a lot is that food safety was very different. So back then, if they had run out of food or their rations were getting very limited, this is an apple that's clearly been enjoyed by a bug or a worm or something as well. But if you were hungry and you didn't have any other food, would you eat this apple? If you were starving, you probably would. But today we have a lot of choices and we have food everywhere. So, you know, we have food that's very easily prepared. It's already washed and packaged into a bag for us. So all we have to do is open that bag and it's ready to go. From another food safety standpoint is because they would be limited to the amount of food that they would had and they would need to eat whatever was available. A lot of times food, when it was contaminated with extra bacteria, it would make people sick. And that sickness would actually lead for a lot of people to die back then. So lifespan was significantly shorter because they would get sick from the foods they were eating because maybe sewage ran into a field and they didn't know that those foods had been contaminated. Whereas now, if you've ever heard that, you know, lettuce has been recalled or it's been removed from the shelves or onions have been taken off of the shelves, we've got some pretty good testing techniques so that as soon as a food has been found to be contaminated with bacteria, we can remove it so that nobody else is getting sick or putting themselves at risk. They didn't have that technology back in the day, and so it did cause a lot of people to get very sick and even pass away because of that. So when we look at specific food sources that our pioneers were eating, they still needed protein, they still needed carbohydrate, which we'll talk about next. And that protein specifically is going to help us build strong muscles and help us grow. Now, there are types of protein that they would eat you might recognize. So eggs, you can get those from chickens. So that was pretty available. Dry beans, we also have beans today that we eat. They may look a little different. So if you don't buy dried beans, they're very hard. They have to be soaked in water before they're boiled. And it takes about 6 hours for that process to get the beans where you can actually chew them and eat them, compared to canned beans, which are already cooked for you. And you literally just have to open up the can and they're ready to go. Bacon or salt pork was a really popular protein option that was shelf stable, so it could last for a long period of time. Milk, or they would take that milk and make it into cheese and cream and yogurt. So they would have different protein options from their cow as well. And then fish, if there was a stream nearby or a lake, they could actually go fishing and get some different sources of fish. So these probably look pretty similar to you, to some of the protein options that you eat, but we're not eating bear very often. So you saw the bear hides, and if they were hunting and they found a bear, they could use that as a protein source as well. And then squirrels even could be a protein source. So again, if you're limited on food, you're going to eat whatever is available. But I don't know many people nowadays who are eating squirrels as part of their protein source. So again, some similarities and some differences here. Now, carbohydrate are foods that give us energy to think, learn, and play. And pioneers needed them so that they could hunt and gather and be able to travel as well. So the carbohydrate sources that pioneers would eat would be hardtack, which was like a cracker. It's like a really thick, hard to eat cracker. Think of it that way. So these crackers could travel for long periods of time. They could last through heat and cold. So they stayed good for a long time. So they were great because they could rely that this food source would stay good and not cause them to get sick. Also grains, which you're probably familiar with, wheat and rice were the two big grains. Potatoes were also popular as well. They would take wheat, make it into these pioneer crackers, or make it into bread as well, which they would cook on that pot on the fire. And rice was a very easy grain too. With the wheat, when you think about us eating bread today, we would go to the grocery store and you can buy a loaf of bread that's already in a package and ready for you. Whereas their wheat, if you see the the kind of yellowish colored stalk at the bottom of that picture, that's wheat. So they would have to take that, break it down into individual wheat kernels, grind it up, mix it with water and other things to make it into a flour and an actual dough, and then cook it before they would get bread. So it was a lot longer process to get bread. Corn was a very popular carbohydrate and probably one of the easiest ones for them to pick and then be able to cook. And then fruit was a carbohydrate as well. Fruit was a little bit harder to manage than it is today because it would go bad really quickly. So if you think about apples, we could put them in the fridge and they can last for a pretty long time, but if they're out in the heat all day, they will go bad pretty fast. So with fruit, they could slice it into thin pieces, keep it out in the high heat or put it on a fire and dehydrate that so it would stay good for longer periods of time. Or they could chop it up and put it in cans with a bunch of sugar, and that would also preserve it to stay good for longer periods of time too. So they would use more of those methods to keep that fruit longer lasting than just fresh fruit. So is nutrition different from pioneers to us? So there's definitely some differences, right? Food is a lot easier to prepare nowadays. We have freezers where we can take bunches of different foods, put them in a container together, freeze them, and they'll last for like 3 to 6 months frozen. So it lasts for a really long time. And then we can cook it super fast too by using either a microwave or a stove. And we can, again, keep foods for a longer period of time, especially fresh foods, by using a refrigerator. Food is always around. So I want you guys to think about where you're at and how long it takes you to either get to a fast food place or a grocery store. And for most of us, it doesn't take very long with modern day travel to get there, right? We basically have food available to us at all times if we need it. And the other thing that's very different is that now we do need more fruits and vegetables in our diet because we do live for such a longer period of time. We're living for almost double what the pioneers were living. And so we need that nutrition to help us stay healthy for a longer period of time. What's not different? We still need meats, grains, beans, nuts, fruits, and all of those food groups to stay healthy. So really the food groups they needed back then are the same food groups we need today. We just understand more about it and we understand what happens if we're not getting those food groups and why they experience some of the diseases that they did. We need to eat and drink every single day as well. So we have the modern convenience that food is very it's very available to us. There's never a time where we don't have food relatively close by. So that's different, but we still need to be eating and drinking every single day. The pioneers didn't get that luxury of always having food available. So did pioneers eat the same foods as us? Yeah, mostly. They really did eat similar things to us. They just didn't have as much variety as we do because they were confined to whatever was available in their area, and it was a lot more work. So if you can imagine, basically preparing and getting food was a full-time job. You had to spend a lot of time hunting, gathering, preparing, and then cooking food, and then trying to preserve it so it would last for long periods of time. Whereas today, we can buy something, put it in the fridge, not think about it for 2 or 3 days, and come back to it later and it will still be okay. So that's pretty cool that we can do that today. So our modern day food is a lot safer. It's easier to cook and easier to get. It's easier to keep fresh. And again, we get a lot more variety because we can get California avocados and Florida oranges all in the same grocery store in Colorado, which is pretty cool. So if I had to guess what a plate looked like for our pioneers, I would guess this gray plate on the left is about what theirs looked like, which is pretty different than what we have today, right? So they had more grains. They were moving around a lot more. They didn't have as many fruits and vegetables quite as available, or they would go bad faster. And when they did have protein, they would have that protein piece in there too. But there was probably times where they only had those crackers and no actual protein source. So I would guess it looked about like that gray plate some of the times. Whereas today, the biggest difference that you'll see is that fruits and vegetables, we need a lot more than what pioneers did. Again, because we live for a lot longer period of time and we need to stay healthy for a longer period of time as well. So thank you guys